thanks to the Anchorage Public Library staff who maintain all our programs, and to all the library champions who support books and readers. In past years, Friends of the Library has hosted Beyond the Stacks, a fundraising dinner with live and silent auctions and guest speakers. We're hoping to get back to that next year, but this year, well, think of this as Beyond the Stacks 2.0. Alaska is an amazing place, and it has created some amazing writers. Today, we'll be hearing from two best-selling, award-winning, all-Alaskan people who fortunately have a great sense of humor and patience, Dana Stabenow and Mark Cameron. Dana, who grew up in Kachemak Bay and still lives in Homer, broke into mystery writing in 1992. Her first mystery, A Cold Day for Murder, received an Edgar Award, and she's gone on to write 37 more books in the Kate Shugak and the Liam Campbell mystery series, as well as work in other genres. Her latest is Spoils of the Dead, which we'll hear more about later today. She's also the creator of Story Knife in Homer, a residential retreat for women writers that's only the second of its kind in the country.
In the world.
Mark, in the world, all right. Mark Cameron of Eagle River is a retired Chief Deputy U.S. Marshal with nearly 30 years in law enforcement. His bio adds that he is a certified scuba instructor and man tracking instructor. Mark is creator of the New York Times bestselling Jericho Quinn and the Arliss Cutter thriller series. And in 2016, he was chosen to continue the Tom Clancy, Jack Ryan Campus thriller series. He has 18 titles in print, and his latest book, Bone Rattle, debuts Tuesday. So you were here first. Mark and Dana have agreed to let us eavesdrop on their conversation about writing the wild, how Alaska affects and enlivens their award-winning mystery and thriller novels. Welcome, Dana and Mark.
Thanks, Carol.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Great. Well, our topic today is writing the wild. So I'd like to start with that, how Alaska is a major character in the novels you write. Now, when we were emailing back and forth to set this up, I jokingly asked how far you'd go in the name of research and whether you'd ever struggled into a Mustang suit and jumped into the icy ocean just so you could write about it. And yes, you both have. So tell us more, and what other adventures in Alaska research have you had?
Go, Dana.
Well, as far as the Mustang suit is concerned, I'm happy to say that I never made it into the water. The whole idea was not to, and the Mustang suit was just in case I did. So I did two different ride-alongs with the Coast Guard, and the second time I had to struggle into the suit was because I got to fly in the helo that we launched from the cutter, and that was very exciting. But I'll tell you, as I told Carol and Mark, the XO of Alex Haley described getting into a Mustang suit as exiting the birth canal. And he was absolutely, that's very eloquent and very accurate. You feel like a stuffed sausage the entire time that you are in it. And you just have to focus on the fact that it's going to save your life if need be.
Absolutely. Yeah, we a trooper, a captain of the C detachment of the troopers, and I worked together doing some public safety academies for youth out in Bush, Alaska, on the Kuskokwim and the Yukon. And we, part of that program was to let kids experience what it was like to be a firefighter, a trooper, or be on a boat. And we tried to make it as exciting as possible and as adventurous as possible. And actually one of the programs we did up in Barrow, and one of those adventurous events was putting on a Mustang suit. So myself and a officer from Bureau of Indian Affairs and another deputy marshal donned our suits and waded out into the Chukchi and met the kids as they came out. Then we showed them how they could float, and it wasn't near as traumatic as jumping into the off from a sinking vessel, but it was pretty interesting being out there for a couple of hours with a ice foot. And the picture that I sent you, it looks like it's out in the middle of this terrible iceberg infested water, but it was iceberg infested, but we could stand up. We were along the shore and we could move out of the way of the oncoming freight trains. But it was great research. And I don't remember who said it. You might remember, Dana, but there is nothing bad ever happens to a writer. It's all research. So I think I can tell from reading Kate Shugak mysteries that you've been there and done that. And I think that's the thing that's what drew me to them, was because I didn't move to Alaska until 98. And I was already reading your books. And I think, and I'd been up here and done some protective work through the Marshal Service, but it's easy to see that just being out among the people is research. Just going to the bush, just working out and fishing is a research project in itself, right?
I had one of the best jobs in the entire world. I wrote the Alaska Traveler column for Alaska Magazine for 5 years. And basically they paid me to fly around Alaska and write about it. And that was incredibly informative. I mean, it was great fun for me. It was great, for the work going forward, because a lot of times if people read your columns in Alaska Magazine, they think, I wonder what else she wrote and could I read her books?
Yeah, right.
But I got tons of ideas from that travel. That's just traveling. That's just getting on a plane and getting off somewhere else. I was asked one time, I can't remember, some writers' conference, and it was the end of a panel, and somebody stood up in the audience and said, do you think you would have written about Alaska if you'd been born somewhere else? I'm not sure I ever came up with an adequate answer for that person, but I have thought about it off and on ever since. And my feeling, of course, is always to say, well, if I'd been born somewhere else, I would have been here, like when I was 18 years old plus 1 day. So I honestly, I'm not sure I have an answer to that question, but I think I would have wound up writing about Alaska, living in Alaska and writing in Alaska, no matter what. And you never turn down an opportunity. You always say yes to any invitation that you have for any adventure that that goes on offer. You never say no.
Yeah,
what's your best adventure?
Go ahead, Dan. What's your best adventure?
Oh, geez. Well, I mean, the ride-alongs with the Coast Guard. The first ride-along I did with the Coast Guard was in the Bering Sea. That was in 2007. Was that 2007? 2004, excuse me. And, flew to Kodiak and drove around through Umnek Pass into the Bering Sea, loitered around offshore of the Pribilofs, and then went down to Slime Banks. And then I got off after 16 days and flew home from Dutch Harbor. Single most expensive plane ride I ever took in my entire life, I would just like to say. There's an adventure for you, paying for airline tickets. But aside from that, this is going to sound a little precious, but I think it's actually true. Growing up in what I would call bush Alaska, which is any community in Alaska you can't drive to. That's essentially, I think, rule of thumb, the bush. And, in small towns and living really basically almost right out in the wild and dealing with everything that comes at you. I mean, some of the things that we did, we should have got killed like 6 ways from Sunday. And many, many things we did not tell our parents about because we never would have been allowed outside the house again. That alone, I think, I was teaching a class in Manicodic one time, and I was trying to convince those kids that, in fact, their lifestyle was, for lack of a better word, romantic, and they all looked very skeptically at me. They were teenagers, teenage cool. And I said, there was a moose outside the school when you came to school today. I said, put up your hands. How many of you people drove 4-wheelers to school today? And half the class put up their hands. And I said, do you really think that a kid in PS 29 in New York is going to even know what a moose or an ATV is? I said, you have a story to tell. And I think that's true of every kid who grows up in bush Alaska.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I was very fortunate with the Marshal Service that we got to go out, and because the mission is so broad, that I got to go out serving papers. I think one of my first assignments was to go seize 30,000 pounds of frozen cod and they weren't very cooperative. I got to tell you, not the cod, the fishermen. They weren't very cooperative for me to find those reefer storage units, but it was still an incredibly interesting trip. I learned things that I remember we flew out on a Marshal Service airplane. We had Manuel Noriega's old 185. And so I got to do some bush flying. I felt like, as a deputy originally from Texas, and then by way of North Idaho and working the Canadian border and then Alaska, I felt like I was flying over the Serengeti Plain. I mean, like I'd stepped out into the pages of a National Geographic or one of your articles in Alaska Magazine, Dana. And it was so amazing to me. And I was actually writing Westerns at the time under a different name, under a pen name. And I just knew that I was going to be a character. And then shortly after that, as a man tracker, I got assigned to track a guy that had, well, I don't have to say allegedly, he's been in prison, but a guy that chopped another guy's head off down in Southeast Alaska with a splitting maul. And they sent me and the Alaska Fugitive Task Force down there to track him. He had fled into the woods. And I remember distinctly thinking then, I'm going to write a story about this place. I mean, Prince of Wales Island was some place that was an unknown to me. Like right now I'm in Texas doing research. I grew up here. This is for one of the Tom Clancy books. And I know the questions I want to ask. What I hope to do is find those Prince of Wales Islands or the bush community kids like in Alaska, the unknowns that I had no idea existed. And those are just so prevalent in Alaska. You find things. One time I was out with some people out of Hooper Bay. He's become a very good friend of mine. And they were allowing me to sit in the boat during a seal hunt. And he put the wooden paddle up to his ear so that the blade of it was in the water so he could hear the seals call. And I would have known to say, hey, how would you hear the seals call when you're out in this open dinghy? But he demonstrated that to me, and that very scene ended up in Shadow of the Dragon, the last Tom Clancy book. So I don't think there's a way, and I think Dana would agree, there's not a way to really quantify the best adventure. Living in Alaska and going to these places that are at least an hour from Anchorage are the best adventures there are.
I benefited a great deal from all the adventures. I continue to benefit a great deal from all the adventures other people have. And one thing that is really that is such a gift, being a writer and being, reasonably well known, is that people want to tell you their stories and they're fully expecting to see them show up in a book. Yeah. There's just so many stories in my books that are the result of stories that have been that have been told to me by my father, by my cousins, by my friends. Here's one that hasn't won. Do you want to hear I don't know if you even call this an adventure, or there's a gazillion Anchoragites who've done this. When in the spring low tides and the spring and the fall low tides, people climb into planes and they fly down to Polly Creek. So because a sandbank emerges, it's on the west side of Cook Inlet, lower down, and you land on the sandbank, which basically appears out of the, Cook Inlet. It's not a beach. And so you land there and you unload your clam gun and your 5-gallon bucket. And if you're in a Super Cub, as we were, it takes you almost 3 hours to get down there. And I don't know about you, but after a 3-hour plane ride in a Super Cub, I got to pee. And so there are planes all over this gigantic sandbar. There's everybody's already flown down there. It's huge, it's miles long. So there's no private place to do your business. And I looked at Dad and Dad looked at me and he had this, I'll just clean it up and say he had a grin on his face. And he looked at me and he said, you go off the tail, I'll go off the stern. So I did. And fortunately that was pre-cell phones. So I'm fairly sure there's no photographic evidence of my big old butt hanging out over the sand down at Polly Creek. But I'll tell you, that kind of thing happens all the time, anytime you travel into Bush, Alaska.
Oh, yeah.
And it's fun and it's funny in the retelling, and it adds that wonderful bit of local color to every book you write that is set in the state. So you keep your ears open for those stories.
There are things that people don't understand that don't live in either super rural areas or I remember going on I don't even remember what kind of tracking mission it was, but it was with 3 other trackers, and we were up out of the Fred Blixt cabin up on the Hall Road. and kind of deploying from there. And there's a little outhouse there, and it was I don't know how cold it was, but the thermometer in Fairbanks said 46 below or something. And the thermometers in your vehicles only go to 40 below and stop, because 40 below centigrade, 40 below Fahrenheit is the same. So we knew it was 40 below or better. And I got we'd like drink as much as we could, because we were afraid our cars were going to freeze, and we'd drink as much as we could. So we'd get up to pee every 2 hours and then start our cars and then pee and then go back to sleep, drink some more, and then, Kool-Aid or Gatorade or whatever. So I got up in the morning to stoke the fire. And one of the other deputies was coming in with a pair of brand new moose and beaver hide mittens, those big over mitts, and they were draped around his shoulders, but they weren't his. They were another deputy's that was cooking breakfast. And the deputy that owned the mittens said, what are you doing with those? He goes, well, I had to go to the outhouse. And he said, well, why are you taking my mittens? And he said, well, because my butt would freeze to the seat if I didn't set on mittens, and I wasn't going to use mine. And so that's ended up in a book. Little things like that. You got to write stuff down and remember it and plug it in.
Mm-hmm. It's that, Alaska.
Yeah.
There's a reason there's so many writers up here.
Yeah, absolutely. Where else do you have to take a stick with you into the outhouse in the winter to chop the little stalagmite down? That's
I was going to say something about that, Mark, but I thought I'd be too delicate.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'll take one for the team.
Good.
I wrote some stories for Boys Life, and I was talking to the editor of Boys Life, and she told me, every short story for these 13 or 14-year-old boys needs to start out with death or poop, and because you got to grab them right from the beginning. So we got that.
You and Gary Paulson.
Yeah, there you go.
So do you, this was a question that one of the people watching asked us, do you use field researchers to check your facts or to bring you stories or to go places that you can't get to when you're working on a book? And if so, how can this person be one?
I'm happy for anybody to volunteer to be a field researcher for me. I'm embarrassed to say that, honestly, the first time I ever heard the term field researcher was in your email, Carol.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, I get emails and they say, I'm surprised you answered my email. I'm surprised it made it through your staff. And I'm like, oh, yeah, well, you have to go through a serious vetting process to get to me through my staff, which is the Yahoo people. I think Dana really hit it on the head when she said we use, in a good way, I hope they think, we use all the people that are out there living their lives anyway. And they might not know they're doing research for us, but they're out. Bush teachers I have many friends that are Bush teachers, and they are often so lonely that they just spill their stories when you're out there on the my wife and I spent a couple of weeks on the Kuskokwim, on the Kobuk, doing some literacy programs, like it sounds like you've done, Dana, and just talking to the kids. And we would bring hot cocoa and cookies that they couldn't get at their stores and just sit and talk to the teachers at night. And it was good for them to be able to talk, but I let them know right up front, I'm taking notes here, ladies and gentlemen.
Oh, I generally have the notepad out.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah. I remember sitting in a big meeting in Washington, D.C. with a bunch of other chief deputies and two assistant directors of the Marshal Service. And everybody knew I was writing. I'd already started to write the Jericho Quinns, and I was about to retire. And they also knew that I had a little book. And one of the assistant directors popped off with some pithy quote, and I laughed at it. And he looked at me just shot in the heart that I didn't take my book out. And he was like, what the heck? That is book worthy. So that's who we're looking for.
I remember one of my favorite, I'm just going to go ahead and tell the story. It's just like my all-time favorite story, and it's to do with my father, of course. And he went herring spotting, and I was really unhappy because at that time, and probably still, I don't think that that is the safest occupation. And I didn't want him to do it. And when I found out he was doing, his friend Jack spilled the beans to me because he knew I was going to go off, and I really did. I rained all over Dad's parade. My voice was raised. Yes, indeed it was. Anyway, so off he went to go herring spotting, and he came, and I knew he was going to be back in like 2 or 3 weeks, and I didn't hear. And I didn't hear. And I knew that he was back then. I had heard from friends, and I thought, So I went up to his house. I knocked on the door. He opened the door, and his right hand, the middle finger, naturally it would be the middle finger, had this humongous white cast on it. And I looked at him and I said, "What did you do?" And so he started talking really fast. And he said that he had walked the prop through on his super cab with the magneto on. And of course it caught and came around, and he was lucky that he didn't lose not only his finger, but his entire hand. So I said what I thought. And then I stopped in the middle of it, and I got a piece of paper and a pencil, and I said, "Tell me how you did that exactly."
Exactly.
And it wound up being the murder method in the first William Campbell novel, right in the first chapter.
It's priceless. Those sorts of things are just gold. They really are. And a good writer, I say this all the time, we're like mollusks. We're like razor clams. We're just down there filtering whatever we can, or an oyster. We're filtering and getting those gold moments that are.
We're thieves.
Yeah, we are
thieves.
Admittedly so.
I think Dad was just relieved that, I'd moved targets. So.
Well, how do you explain to people outside Alaska exactly what herring spotting is, or what? There's a lot of different things unique about Alaska. And Dana, you mentioned you sometimes get weird questions from readers who are outside Alaska, and you're having to explain the world to them, I guess, or our world to them.
Well, I'll bet you Mark can answer this just as well. As you always, as a writer, the one thing that you want to avoid is the expository lump. You have to explain things so that the reader understands them, but you don't want to lecture, and you want to insert as much action into that scene as you possibly can. Sometimes you can't avoid the expository lump, but those are the sections of the book that I tried to edit, and I just go back and edit and try to tell them in the least amount of words I possibly can, because I don't want to lose the interest of the reader. And if I'm actually spending that much time on it, it's that important to the plot. Mm-hmm. But that's basically my answer to that is, I'll tell you, editing is your friend. That as a writer, I mean, editing is your friend. You go back over it and over it and over it and over it again, and you distill it down into, the least amount of language you possibly can. I'm not a big fan of Ernest Hemingway, but as far as I'm concerned, he's one of the best stylists in the English language that we have, because he does so much in such a small space. And I always tell beginning authors that they should read poetry, because poets too have to concentrate so much into such a small space. Reading good poetry is an excellent way to learn how to be a better writer.
No, absolutely. It was the Jefferson quote that I'd have written a shorter letter, but I didn't have the time. It takes time to do a short stories, or to me, that's what I wanted. I was naive as a young writer when I was 19, 20, and thought I could make a living writing short stories. And now, especially now, I mean, back when I started, I was making, $600, $1,200 a short story. And now you get kudos. You're online with a short story. You hardly get paid at all. But it was a great learning experience. And I remember writing a 1,500 word short story, which is their maximum for Boy's Life. And man, it was 1,878 words when I finished it. And so I read it over to my wife. I edited and, parsed it down and got it to 1,492 or whatever. And the editor said, "Yep, this is perfect. But you know what? we have this really good piece of art that we want to put in your story. So we'd like it to be closer to 1,200 words. And so I did it again, and I did it again. And and you know what? It's a better story, but it took me a long time to write 1,200 words. But to your original question, Dana's absolutely right as far as the expository stuff. And I have to do a bit of that with the Clancy's just because it's hard to, people that read those want to know about a Wärtsilä engine and how many, whatevers and all that. And that's just part of, I think they read them with TI graphing calculators and dictionaries and just checking my work. And in fact, I have like nuclear scientists email me to say polonium-2 whatever does not have this half-life. And I'm like, dude, I'm just happy a nuclear scientist is reading my books. But what I try to do with my RLIS books, for instance, if I'm going to explain to the reader about tracking, I would just say, I don't know why my sister's phone's ringing. Sorry, nobody ever called her. I would have a layman. I would have a layman in a character that doesn't know about tracking that the main character is teaching. And I know Dana does that too. If you have an outsider from Alaska or somebody that's not a trooper or an investigator, for instance, it allows you to have some dialogue and action. And then I can say, well, this is what a tracker does. Or somebody can say, why are you doing that, Arliss or Kate or whatever? And you teach a character in the book where you're really teaching the reader. And I as a reader enjoyed that, and that moves the story along. So it's not if we're doing it right, it's not as just a blast of here's what I know from all my research, which incidentally we'll do, and I'm sure this is the way that Dana does it, I can tell from her writing, you'll do weeks of research and 2% of it ends up in the book. Oftentimes
that 2% is a gem.
Yeah, that's high. out of weeks of research.
You never know though.
You don't. But the thing is, you can't, what research does is it helps you not to get it wrong. So you're writing around things and you don't write in something wrong, and the right stuff is right, but it's honestly, you're right, less than 2%.
Mm-hmm. I think that's probably a rule of thumb that holds true for every writer. Or certainly crime fiction writers.
Yeah.
And thriller writers.
Otherwise, you're like opening up the reader's head and pouring.
Yeah, no, and you'll lose them.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
You'll lose them. Yeah.
Exactly. There's a thing that gaming. One of my friends is a game designer for. Well, I won't even say the company because it sounds horrible, but it's a big company, and that might have a Bugs Bunny as a mascot, but it's a big gaming company, and they talk about the compulsion loop a lot, and how their goal is to make young gamers or old gamers, whoever, not go outside and play soccer. Basically, they want to have them turning, going to the next game, going to the next stage, or on their phone, flipping to the next. And as writers, we really want the same thing. I mean, I'd love you to go out and play soccer and see some sunshine, but I don't want you to put the book down at night. My favorite emails are from readers that say, curse you, Mark Cameron, because I didn't sleep at all. And that if you start doing what Dana and I are talking about not doing, people, okay, I'm going to read another chapter, but I can do it tomorrow, or I'll skip this part. And like Elmore Leonard said, I'm going to edit out all the stuff the readers skip. Try to, anyway.
Try to, yeah. That was really good advice.
Well, but when you're looking for this research, I've always wondered how you make contacts in law enforcement. And Mark, that's kind of cheating for you because you have a
yeah, I'm jealous.
Long background to draw on.
Me.
I know, but when you want to check proper procedures in a police department in a particular case, or how evidence is handled or something like that, can you just call up the cop shop, as we used to call it, and say, you got somebody around who can answer a question for me? Or do you cultivate your own sources? I'd be interested in knowing, because I know that I was a reporter for many years, and sometimes the police have an adversarial position with writers. And I wonder if that carries over to novelists as well, or if they're waiting for you to pull out your notebook and write it down.
I have never experienced any kind of adverse or negative feedback from law enforcement officers. And there's, I mean, really, you can call up your local police department, and any citizen can do this and request a ride along. And you can ride along with the officers. In fact, I flew to Dillingham, which is what Newenham and the Liam Campbell novels is loosely based on, and did a ride along with a cop down there, and was out with him for half the night. And now I at that time knew where all the drug dealers in Dillingham were, all three of them. And and you know, and you're sitting there in the dark waiting for something to happen, and the guys tell stories. And you know, if you're in the dark, it's hard to take notes, but I did my best. They're pretty scribbly afterwards, but I had a ton of ideas for books after that. And it's been my experience, not just with police officers, but with anyone. I think almost anyone is happy to tell you about their job. Oh, yeah. They're happy to hear, to have someone really listen to them when they talk about how they do their job and tell you war stories. You know, that's always been my experience anyway.
No, absolutely. And from the receiving end, I've got, as the chief, because I was the information officer for the District of Alaska, those basically because deputies didn't want to deal with it, so they would shunt them off to me anyway. But I was happy to talk to other writers, you know, because I was a writer already. But a public information officer I'm going to a police department in Texas tomorrow. I'm driving out to West Texas, and I didn't know them. I sent a email to their PIO and said, I write these books. You can look me up on the web. So that makes it a little easier when you're somebody like Dana that's already known.
And Mark.
Really, yeah, and or me, but I've found the same thing that you have when I chat with folks. They want to tell their story, and they want to. Police officers, especially now in this, and I won't get political about it. My son is an Anchorage police officer. I'm proud of him. I'm proud of what he does. He's happy. He's got his wife sometimes says, he's so happy to go to work. It seems like it's not even work. And he loves his job. He loves the camaraderie. In this day and age across the United States, policemen want the good police officers want they want to tell their stories. I got to go through some training at Creech Air Force Base, which is really hard to get into unless you ask, right? And I was able to get into where they fly remotely piloted aircraft. And it's like going to a different country. In fact, when you go into one of the little cubicles where they're flying the drones, they don't like them to call them that, they're RPAs. When they're flying the Predators or those other drones, RPAs, don't X that out. When they're flying those, there's a sign on the wall that says you're now entering a war zone, because you walk in and you got your control here, but the device you're flying, the aircraft you're flying is 8,000 miles away. And so they put themselves in that mind. And I remember I included a scene from Creech Air Force Base with a RPA pilot, and I talked about some of the hassle, because I talked to some, I'd never been there, but I talked to some that were retired, and about the working all day, being in the war zone, and then going home and have to fix the water heater or go to your kid's soccer game. There's no decompression time, right? So I wrote about that. So I went in to talk, having already written that book, and there was a little cadre of us there going through this tour, and the captain that was talking said, has anybody ever heard of Creech or what we do here? And do they know about remotely piloted aircraft? And then his head kind of snapped around. He looked at me. He said, except for you stand over here. And I thought, holy crap, he's read the book. And so he had read the book, and he corrected me on a couple of things. But one thing that he was happy with, and he wanted me to spread the good word here to anybody I talk to, is they are proud of the mission they're doing. They're men and women that are every bit as vital as a pilot of an F-16. And again, I'm not trying to get political, but they are fighting the good fight, and they feel like that oftentimes writers, Hollywood especially, just talks about how many hangups they have and how much PTSD they have. Now, admittedly, there's a chaplain there and some psychologists, and they do take care of them. But by and large, these were just incredibly valiant, brave men and women that are just doing a job. And I find that with police work. Certainly there are bad apples, and my son, myself, my good friends, we want to root those bad apples out as bad as anyone, maybe worse. But the folks that are doing it really want to tell their story. So I think when somebody comes in as a writer and is earnest about telling the truth, the good and the bad, I think they would find it going on the ride along, like Dana said. And when you go on a ride along, I went with my son, which is probably the most terrifying ride along you could ever go on. Because I'm like, what happened to my little boy? But in fact, I told my wife when he first got cut loose from field training, I had just retired, like a year. I have a photograph. My oldest son was an OSI agent for the Air Force. He's a physician now, but he was a special agent for the Air Force, like Jericho Quinn. And I have a picture of him holding up a badge, me holding up my retired badge, and my youngest son holding up his recruit badge, from all at the same time. We just overlapped. But I told my wife I was just a little bit miffed with her because I had gastritis and a headache, and I was just so worried. I was just eating myself alive because my little boy was out. And any of his friends are going to crucify him if they hear me talking about him. But it just killed me to think about my son out there on the street all by himself. And I told my wife, I said, Vicky, how are you taking this so good? And she smiled and she said, Mark, this is new to you. I've been feeling this terror for 30 years. And I said, okay, I'll be quiet now. Back to you.
I have also had really good experiences with the FBI in the past. I used to make a habit of, whenever the FBI showed up in one of my books, later on, as I had some street cred, I had some books published, as one of the guys that I would talk to in Anchorage was Eric Gonzalez. And yeah, you knew Eric, and then he retired on me. The nerve. Anyway, I remember the last time I was in his office and I ran this plot by him, and he went white, and he said, Dana, we're actually afraid of that very thing. And I'm just making this stuff up. I'm not prescient. I'm a law enforcement officer or anything, but that kind of shocked me a little bit, that I could actually scare an FBI agent. And then he sent me downstairs to the gun room with Bob, and I forget the other guy's name, and I got to look at all the guns that they had confiscated and in their armory, and holy cow. Yeah, I can recognize a 30-06 and a 22 revolver, and that's about it. And that's really all I need to. So they made me hold them. And what frightened me most, I think, was how lightweight so many of them were. But sorry, I didn't mean to go off topic. But again, back to your original question, back to the whole field researcher thing. Mark is right. We have all the field researchers we can possibly want, but we always want more.
You had a comment, Dana, that you were interested in hearing about the first time a character made you laugh out loud or cry, and that made me think that maybe you had a story.
Well, it's I'm trying to remember when, after I asked you that question, I thought, well, when I remember sitting there and laughing when a character made me laugh out loud, but I can't remember what it was or which character. I can remember the desk I was sitting at. I can even remember the laptop I was working on, the make and the model. And I think it was probably in Breakup, I'm sure, but maybe not. But I do definitely remember the first time that a character made me cry. And that was when Jack died in, spoiler alert, Hunter's Moon. I remember I didn't know that scene was going to go that way. And when I wrote it, you know how you can just like block an entire text and delete it on a laptop? I mean, not like the old typewriter days. You can just like efface entire chapters out of your narrative if you want to. And I remember my hand hovering over the mouse as the tears are streaming down my face and then pulling back. And then I saved and shut it down and I quit work for the day. But that was it. I was a wreck. I was done.
Oh, yeah.
I knew I was a writer then, for sure.
But that hit you, you know, what's Frost? No tears in the writer, no tears in the reader. I think when we feel it, I get this little flush when I'm like, okay, these 4 words out of this whole novel are pretty good. And I want to keep these 4 words. So yeah, I had a character in one of the early Jerichos named Veronica. She goes by Ronnie. I like really strong women characters to interact with. I write generally from a male point of view because that's me, but I do really like to have these strong women characters. And so Ronnie Garcia was originally going to become just a valiant, brave sacrifice at the beginning of the book. And we first meet her when she's getting out of the shower in CIA headquarters. And so we see her scars and how tough she is. And she's grew up in Cuba, but she's an American citizen, and she wants to be a clandestine officer, but she's a uniformed officer. And so I'm going to have her go and face these bad guys, unbeknownst to her. And the more I described her, the more I realized this girl is beautiful. She is beautiful in her heart. She is tough. I can't kill her. And certainly it wasn't her making that decision, but and then she's been Jericho Quinn. She's been Jericho Quinn.
Yes, it was. I'm contradicting you.
I know people say that. I would have bad dreams at night if I thought that, but I agree. I have to agree. She was just too good a character to let go of. But she didn't make me cry. She just, in fact, there's, you know, my wife always says that every female character in the book is a little bit of her, and you know, and this girl's the bad ones as well. But I was writing a scene with Jericho's ex-wife, who there's Team Ronnie and Team Kim, and my readers, like, some of them wanted to get back with his ex-wife, most of the men wanted him to get back with stay with Ronnie, because she's often described as running a lot because of her ghetto booty, and she describes herself that way, and she's just sort of a big boned fighting Cuban girl that's hard to kill off, you know. And so I have Kim and another character with a guy tied to the bed, and these are just wives, they're not the spy types. They have a guy tied to the bed that's tried to kill him, and I told my wife, what would you do here if the guy's trying to kill you? And she and I walked through that entire scene, and I get more emails about that scene of these 2 women torturing this guy with a red toolbox they dragged in from and one of the women, by the way, is a single amputee above the knee. And so her and this Cajun girl are, you know, using channel locks and hammers, and they're not actually torturing him. They're just making him think he's going to be tortured. And the dialogue back and forth is all my wife. Just me talking back and forth to it, and it's honestly, it's the best stuff I've ever written, and it was her. So that's the most I've ever laughed of any book.
I would, you know, I want to go back to what you were first saying about how this character was meant to be a sacrificial lamb, and when we all have those in our books, and how basically she just wrote herself into a recurring character. I would also add that when you're writing series fiction, when you're continuing characters on from book to book, that it is wise. I mean, if that gift is given to you by your muse, let's put it that way. Sometimes we don't organize these things. Sometimes they just, you know, are a gift from the writing gods. But I think in series fiction, it's a really good idea to find one of those characters. That's a good way to put it, to find one of those characters, a new character for like every single book that you write. Maybe that character doesn't show up in every single book, but that is because I always go back to this too when I'm talking about the craft of writing, is that we're trying to make it as real as possible. And in our lives, every day of our lives, we meet new and interesting people that become part of our lives in some respect going forward. Maybe it's just someone we never forget. And so that you ought to, as much as possible, have that, incorporate that into the writing of serious fiction as well. I mean, you know, you got to pull out every trick in the writing book if you're going to, you know, hope to have people still reading your books after you've written 22 of them. So I think that is very important. And I'm not sure that I always knew that, but it is something that I've learned as hopefully my craft has improved over the years.
Well, I think you're exactly right. And I go back and forth with readers sometimes because they're like, where is so-and-so? And I'm like, that's the best compliment I could have.
Oh yeah.
Not enough page time to, and sometimes like, well, you left me hanging with so-and-so. And I'm like, no, this part is done, but that's the way life is. If you were to do a ride along with the police, you might be around when 2 out of 15 calls have a closure. And so out of this book, you want to have your A plot and your B plot, or however you do it, have a beginning, middle, and end. But there's all these other things that are happening in life, whether it's a really cruddy teenage child or whatever, that those are plots that are happening to us in life. And I think that gives that shot of reality that lets the reader jump into the middle of the story. And then when they're done, you're not, you know, it's funny. Readers are funny. They're like, you're just trying to make me read the next book. Well, yeah, absolutely I am.
And we're putting those characters in the bank.
Yeah,
that's
exactly,
our personal bank that we're putting them in the bank, and you know, we're going to make a withdrawal from that bank at some point in the future. That's always the plan. I remember when I was with apropos of what you said, Mark, when I was doing the ride along in the Bering Sea with the Coast Guard, we did a SAR, search and rescue. Fisherman on a longliner, I think it was, got a hook caught in his eye, and it's in the middle of the night, and you know, what are we going to do? And so they finally decide that they're going to launch the helo, and they're going to go airlift him off. And the skipper of the longliner is terrified. You can hear it in his voice over the radio, because they're going to be dropping a basket on a line down in the middle of all his rigging, and he's panic stricken. And I mean, not panic stricken. No skipper, no deep sea Bering's fisherman is ever panic stricken. But I mean, you could tell the apprehension in his voice. Well, I don't know. I got a lot of gear up there, he said over the radio. Well, they did a textbook thing. You know, they got the guy off, they got him airlifted out to the Pribilofs, St. Paul, where they either they already had a life flight there or one was on its way. And the captain turned to me and he said, the worst part is we never know how the story ends. They never know. They never know what happens to these guys after they get them out of danger and get them off to safety. That's it. Their job is done. Then they're going on. And I'll bet you that law enforcement officers around the world feel like that. A lot of them don't know the ends of all these stories with which their lives intersect. And we can reflect that in
absolutely. But that's the story, Dana. That's a wonderful story for a reader to see when you're from the point of view of those Coast Guardsmen and women, and they don't get to know that angst that's going on. I remember standing post in a suit with my earpiece on, and it was the Sultan of Brunei had put something on. It was during one of the UN General Assemblies, and I was on the Japanese foreign minister detail, and I was at a little small table, and they were talking about well, it was just interesting world politics between China and Japan. And even back then, this would have been in 93, maybe. Even back then, there's still some already some tension about the islands in the South China Sea and stuff. So there was interpretations going on. There's this little tete-a-tete going on between these high level, like foreign ministers, and the foreign minister of China at the time, or still is, the vice president of China. So the foreign minister of China, the foreign minister of Japan, and I'm listening to the interpreters. I speak some Japanese, so I'm there, and doggone it, they came in and they pushed me. They came in and said, all right, it's your time for break. I was like, no, but there's this huge push system where you got to go eat your wilted salad in the basement with all the cooks instead of being
robbed.
I was robbed of what happened. And I've tried to figure out how to use that in a book, but it just has, it's not, there's not enough gunplay in it. But someday I'll put that in there. And I don't know what happened. I could have solved the world problem if I didn't know.
Would you put the pandemic in a book? I mean, it's reality. It's something we're dealing with now. Is that maybe a future plot line or?
Not for me. I've written so many pandemic books that my first, I think 2 of my first books were Jericho Quinn trying to stop like weaponized Ebola or something like that. And then another one, a pandemic somewhat like this. In fact, I had a guy email me the other day saying, I'm sitting here by an ECMO machine reading about ECMO machines in Kanab, Utah. And thanks for the read, but I'm sweating to death and you're scaring me. In my books, if Jericho failed, the pandemic flows across the earth. And you know, you look back at, and other writers are putting it in. It's just my personal way of writing. There's some, but the stories that I like to read that were written during the Spanish flu don't have a lot about the flu in them. So I'm probably not, unless the Clancy editors tell me I have to. And right now they haven't told me that.
I wrote about the influenza pandemic in, I think it was The Singing of the Dead, and then also in another book, I referred to it. And, you know, it was onerous enough living through this pandemic. I would just as soon leave it in the rear view. You're quite right, Carol. You know, it's absolutely, it's real life. But, and I don't think we can, I'm not sure, Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that we can not refer to it at all. But I don't think I'm going to have any of my characters living through it. I think maybe after the fact is the best that I can do. However, I will say that that is how I feel today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think one thing that's important, it depends on the kind of writer you are. Like people will sometimes chastise me in a Clancy book after I've written in the aftermath of a Clancy book, because they'll point out, well, Russia's hasn't done this and China hasn't done this. And I said, of course they haven't. But in a Tom Clancy book, we got in a shooting war with Japan. This is like the real world. It is not the real world. This is we have the same, physics and science and general government, but this is a whole Clancy universe. And there's not the president in Arliss Cutter is not the president. The president in the Jericho Quinns is a completely different setup. I don't like to get political in my books. I like to talk about politics through my characters, geopolitics, but I really want these books to be escapes instead of, like taking a puppy's face and pressing it into where it wet on the carpet. And that's what COVID has been to me. And I don't want to put my readers through that. I want them to have even though it's blood and guts and explosions and whatever, chase scenes and tension, I want it to be a happy release, fun time for them.
I am eternally reminding people that, yes, in fact, I write fiction.
Yeah.
Made right up, in the immortal phrase of Mike Dugan.
but now both of you, and this is, we're kind of running low on time here, so this is a good segue. That's the future. That's COVID and the present. Both of you in your latest books have involved archaeology, which is the past. So I'd be interested to hear how you developed those books and how that's coming along. Dana, yours came out in February.
Yeah. Spoils of the Dead, by great title, huh? Thank you, Robert Frost. Yeah, and I don't have a long story to tell you. There's not a long involved story here. What I did was I read a bunch of books by Janet Klein, who is a local archaeologist in Kachemak Bay and is a good writer too. And I think Actually, I think I read an excerpt of something that she wrote as part of a, it was like a large collection of writings about archaeology on the Kenai Peninsula entire. And I followed that excerpt back to another book that she had written, and I read it and I thought, man, I thought to myself, there are plenty of reasons for people in Alaska to get in fights with each other, and resource extraction is at the top of the list. And anything that gets in the way of resource extraction is a trigger for an awful lot of Alaskans. Let's see what I could do with this.
Mm-hmm. No,
that's not a long explanation. There you go. That's Janet. It's all Janet Klein's fault.
We have a young man that grew up with my youngest son, and he's an archaeologist, and his job now, he lives in Hawaii now, but his job is to sit and watch when digs are being done for utility lines or whatever. And if he sees something, he's Alaska Native and Hawaiian, and so he's got the archaeology background plus the native background, and he watches. And if the bucket of that shovel comes upon a piece of amber glass or a bone shard or whatever, that dig stops. Now you can imagine how popular he is, like Dana said. So I called him and I said, hey, do you care if I kill you off in a book? I think this is, and he grew up with my son. And so we did a lot of chatting back and forth. So I had in my mind that there was going to be some sort of fragment found in Southeast Alaska. And I went down to Juneau to do some research. Ended up, I had no idea it was going to go this direction, but I ended up linking up with some folks, a guy named Brian Weed that runs Juneau's Hidden History. And he took me down in some mines, and we did and he showed me some places where there was and he's very respectful. He doesn't like take it away, but he found what he believes is a shaman's grave. And I just sort of took that moment, moved it over to where, you can't put roads through the Tongass, but you can put a road where there used to be a road, like the old riprap, I can't remember what they call them, corridor roads. And so I just envisioned my son's young friend on a dig where they're putting in a new road, and they find this bone rattle, and sort of the havoc that trying to get that and keep that, and basically keep the mine going when this piece of archaeology, this small piece of archaeology that's really a raven rattle, but raven rattle doesn't fit as well on the cover of a book, so it turned into bone rattle.
So what's next for both of you? Anything you can tell us?
Well, I'm just finishing up the second Eye of Isis novel. It's called Disappearance of a Scribe. It's set in Alexandria in the time of Cleopatra. I'm having so much fun with these books. And that goes into the publisher on May 3rd. And after that, I'm going to work on the third book in the series, which tentatively is titled Death of an Idol, which is not what you think it means. That's all I'm going to say about that.
Very good. Very good. So I am in the middle. I'm pretty much neck deep into the next Tom Clancy, Jack Ryan. It's called Chain of Command. Has to do with the 25th Amendment and some things like that, and some stressors that befall Jack Ryan. And I'll finish that, turn that in July. That comes out in December. They turn those around very quickly once I turn it in. They've got a big team of editors. And then I'm doing another Jericho and 2 more Arlesses and Arliss cutters, and then we'll see from there. I think I'm gainfully employed for another 2 years.
Mark, tell me something. How many in your Jericho series are there?
There's 8 books and 2 novellas.
How long do you see yourself continuing that series? Do you see an end to them or not?
I've always sort of seen a little an arc, but what I had done is I stepped away, and before the Clancys came along, I was going to do a couple more Jerichos and then sort of move into the Arliss cutters as I finished the Jerichos, but the Arlisses became the thing that I'm doing in between the Clancys, and then I'm going to work in it. I get a lot of emails about the Jerichos, and I love the Jericho Quins. They're sort of over the top. I will say, I know we're running out of time, but just really quickly, I'll say that I wrote a book about Alaska, and I thought, I looked back now and I see that it wasn't that great a book, but I got this really nice rejection letter from Random House, and you know, you hardly get rejection letters anymore. You get an email,
Let alone nice ones.
get anything, right? Well, this was a page and a half. Now imagine, Dana, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
A page and a half rejection letter. We like your writing. We like your storytelling style. And this is going to make people mad. And I won't tell you which editor said it, but they said, who cares about Alaska? And who cares about Alaska Native kids? You need to write about James Bond and Jason Bourne and shoot 'em ups and stuff like that. Well, it really made me angry. And so I went back to the computer and I wrote out the first Jericho Quinn. It was just a shoot 'em up motorcycle riding, the guy that carries a sword behind his back, and it sold and it's been making us money. And so I went back, and the Arliss Cutter books are those Alaska books that I originally tried to write.
So in your eye, editor at Random
Yeah,
House.
exactly. I don't think he's there anymore. That's my story, because I write for Random House now for the Clancy, so it's not the same guy.
Oh dear. Well, I really hate to cut this off because I still have a long list of questions, and I'm just going to have to send emails to say, but what happened to those young lovers who got smuggled over the pass into Canada, Dana? And I was just reading Shadow of the Dragon last week, and what about? But there comes a time. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to both of you for sharing your time with us today, and for being
about libraries before
being a friend of the library.
I just want to say very, very briefly, I know we're running out of time, that I would not be the person that I am without my hometown librarian, Susan Block English. She started the Seldovia Public Library. I basically lived in it from the moment I learned that it existed. And my gratitude always to her, to libraries and librarians everywhere. I was really honored to be invited to join this talk, and thank you a lot. And I hope everybody who is watching immediately goes to their laptops and looks at their local public library and figures out a way to donate to them.
Oh, absolutely. I second that. I grew up near Hamilton County, Texas, and spent all the time in the Hamilton County Library and Parker County Library. And my aunt retired as a librarian. She was the head librarian in Salt Lake City, Utah. My sister has a library science degree. Books, libraries, they've really made us writers who we are.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Terrific. Well, thank you again so much. And thanks to Kenrick Mock, who's engineering this for us, and to Friends of the Library. And go outside, enjoy the sunshine with a book in your hand.
Or come back in and read it after.
There you go. Thanks all.
Thank you all.
Thank you.